I am Clara,
I never thought
33
I'd be
years
sitting
old,
here telling
and
you
until
this,
last
but
Thanksgiving, I let my
sometimes
family
life
treat me
takes an
like a welcome mat.
unexpected turn.
My sister sprayed prototype perfume directly into my 7-year-old son's eyes. As he screamed in agony, my mother laughed and said, "If he goes blind now, maybe he will not see he is a burden too." My father simply took a sip of his bourbon and added that at least the boy smelled better now. They had no idea they had just signed their own financial and social death warrants. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to destroy a toxic family to protect your child. We were gathered at my parents' sprawling McMansion for our annual Thanksgiving dinner. To my family, I was just the disappointment. They thought I was a data entry clerk scraping by on minimum wage. That was the lie I fed them to keep their greedy hands out of my pockets. In reality, I am a director of forensic auditing for a financial conglomerate in New York. My daily life consists of tracking down corporate fraud and dismantling criminals. But to Richard and Barbara, my parents, I was just the single mother of a disabled child. My son Leo is the light of my life. He wears a leg brace due to an automobile accident. He is incredibly sweet, but sometimes his brace catches on uneven flooring, causing him to stumble. My family treated his disability as a personal inconvenience that ruined their family portraits. My younger sister Brittany is 30 years old and the undisputed golden child. She recently launched a perfume brand funded entirely by my father. Her husband Jamal is an African-American stockbroker who brags about his six-figure commissions. Together they are the pride and joy of the family, while Leo and I are the obligatory charity cases. The dining room was warm that afternoon, filled with the chemical stench of Brittany's new prototype perfume. She had been waving the glass bottle around, spraying it into the air, and demanding we praise the floral notes. Jamal stood beside her, swirling a glass of red wine, loudly predicting how the beauty brand would go global within a single year. Leo was quietly walking across the Persian rug to reach the dessert table. I watched him navigate the difficult terrain, his face focused. Just as he passed Brittany and Jamal, his brace snagged on a tassel at the edge of the rug. He pitched forward, throwing his hands out to catch himself. His left hand collided with the side table. The impact sent Jamal's full glass of red wine tipping over. The liquid splashed across the table, with a few drops landing on the hem of Brittany's silk dress. The room went completely silent. Leo started apologizing profusely, his lower lip trembling as he frantically tried to right himself. I was already out of my chair, moving quickly toward him. But before I could reach my frightened son, Brittany let out a piercing shriek of rage. She looked down at the wine stains on her dress, then looked at Leo with a face twisted in pure hatred. "You clumsy little brat!" she screamed. Without a single second of hesitation, Brittany raised the glass bottle of her prototype perfume, pointed the nozzle directly at my 7-year-old son's face, and pressed down hard. A thick mist of highly concentrated liquid shot straight into Leo's open eyes. The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. Leo let out a blood-curdling scream that tore through my soul. He collapsed onto the floor, clutching his burning face with his hands, kicking his braced leg in agony. He was hyperventilating, crying out that his eyes were burning, that it felt like fire inside his head. I dropped to my knees next to him, trying to pull his hands away so I could see the damaged panic gripping my chest as the chemical smell burned my nostrils. I screamed for someone to get clean water, for someone to call an ambulance. But nobody moved. Instead, the most chilling sound filled the room. My mother Barbara threw her head back and laughed out loud. She looked down at my agonizing child and chuckled. "If he is blind now, maybe he will not see he is a burden too," she said with a casual, sickening smirk. I froze, my blood running cold. I looked up at my father Richard, expecting him to reprimand her or rush to help his grandson. Instead, he took a slow sip of his expensive bourbon, shrugged his shoulders, and smiled. "Well, at least he smells better now," my father said smoothly. Jamal stood next to them, looking down at us with a sneer of utter disgust. "Look at him whining on the floor," Jamal mocked cruelly, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "He is ruining the holiday vibe today." Get him out of here right now before he stains the good rug with his tears. They stood there comfortably in their expensive clothes, watching a disabled 7-year-old boy writhe in chemical agony, treating it like an amusing inconvenience. The raw, unfiltered evil of their immediate reactions snapped something deep inside my brain. The final thread of familial obligation severed completely. I did not waste another precious second arguing. I did not scream back or throw things in a fit of rage. I scooped my violently sobbing son tightly into my arms, holding his burning face securely against my shoulder, and sprinted straight out the front door. I threw him carefully into the back seat of my parked car, my mind shifting instantly from a grieving mother into a cold, highly calculating investigator. I was going to drive to the hospital to save my son first, and then I was going to systematically burn their entire privileged lives straight to the ground, once and for all. The drive to the emergency room was a chaotic blur of blaring horns and aggressively running red traffic lights. In the back seat, Leo whimpered, his small hands hovering near his face, terrified to touch his own skin. I kept one hand on the wheel and reached back to hold his trembling knee. I promised him we were almost there, swallowing the panic in my throat. Skidding to a violent halt in the ambulance bay, I abandoned the car, scooped my son up, and burst through the sliding doors, screaming for help. Triage nurses took one look at Leo's swollen, bright red eyes and immediately rushed him to a decontamination station. They spent agonizing minutes flushing his eyes with saline, trying to wash out the vile substance my sister sprayed. I stood outside the trauma bay, watching through the glass as my boy endured the painful procedure. Every whimper he let out fueled a fire inside my chest that was turning from panic into cold fury. A nurse handed me a clipboard, but my hands were shaking too badly. I needed to know if my son would ever see the world the same way again. An hour later, an ophthalmologist stepped into the waiting area. His face was grim, carrying a folder that made my stomach drop. He led me back to Leo, who was resting under fluorescent lights, his eyes covered with sterile bandages. The doctor sat down and asked me to explain exactly what had been sprayed into my son's face. I told him it was a prototype bottle of organic perfume from my sister's beauty line. The doctor shook his head slowly. He stated firmly that the bottle was absolutely not organic. The chemical makeup resembled toxic industrial solvents found in heavy-duty cleaning supplies, not high-end cosmetics. My sister was peddling toxic waste to the public and had just used it as a weapon against my child. The doctor delivered the devastating diagnosis. Leo had suffered a severe second-degree corneal burn. The tissues on the surface of his eyes had been scorched by abrasive chemicals. While the flushing saved his retinas from total destruction, the damage was profound. He warned me that Leo was facing a real risk of permanent vision loss or severe scarring that could require future surgery. Hearing those words felt like a physical blow. My boy, who faced physical challenges every single day, was now facing potential blindness simply because he stumbled on a rug. I looked at Leo's small frame on the hospital bed and made a silent vow. The people responsible for this would pay with everything they owned. I stepped out of the room and dialed the police, reporting a child assault and detailing exactly what Brittany did. 2 uniformed officers arrived 20 minutes later. I met them in the hallway, ready to press charges for battery and child endangerment. At first, the officers were attentive, taking out their notepads and asking for Brittany's name and address. I gave them the address of my parents' house. The moment I mentioned my father's name, Richard, the older officer's posture changed. He recognized the name immediately. He held up a finger, asking me to wait, and stepped away to make a radio call. When he returned 5 minutes later, the atmosphere had shifted. His notepad was put away. He cleared his throat and adopted a condescending tone. He told me he had just spoken to his precinct captain, a man who happened to be my father's golf partner. The officer explained that my father had already called ahead to clarify the situation. According to Richard, it was merely an unfortunate holiday mishap, a silly misunderstanding between siblings that escalated unnecessarily. I stared at the officers in disbelief. I pointed to the room where my son lay with chemically burned eyes and demanded they arrest the woman who did it. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. The older officer sighed, crossing his arms. He stated flatly the police would not file a formal charge or get involved in a minor family accident. He had the audacity to suggest I calm down and handle it privately with my parents rather than wasting municipal resources. They turned around and walked out of the hospital, leaving me standing alone in the corridor. The harsh reality of the situation washed over me like a bucket of ice water. The system was rigged. My father had used his wealth to build a fortress around his golden child, shielding Brittany from any legal consequences. A simple phone call from a very rich man was enough to silence the police and erase my son's suffering from the official public record. They honestly believed they were untouchable. They thought their vast money and country club connections made them completely immune to any accountability. They thought I was just a helpless single mother, a low-level clerk, who would back down and accept their abuse because I had no other options. They were catastrophically wrong. Standing outside the room, I realized that relying on standard police intervention was a dead end. The authorities were in my father's pocket, willing to sweep a toxic chemical assault under the rug for a powerful friend. If I wanted justice for Leo, I could not depend on a system that catered to the elite. I was entirely on my own. But being on my own was exactly where I thrived. My family did not know the woman I had become. They did not know the skills I possessed or the power I wielded in my professional life. As a forensic auditor, I dismantled corrupt empires for a living. I tracked hidden assets, exposed financial crimes, and destroyed fraudulent legacies with precision. My parents and my sister thought they had won the battle because they controlled the local police, but they had no idea I was about to wage a full-scale war on their entire existence, starting with their bank accounts. The morning sun crept through the thin blinds of my modest apartment, casting pale shadows across the living room floor. I had not slept a single second. I spent the entire night sitting in a hard wooden chair beside my son's bed, listening to his shallow breathing and watching the stark white bandages covering his eyes. The doctor had given us heavy painkillers, allowing Leo to finally drift into a restless sleep, but my mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother laughing, and my father sipping his bourbon, while my child screamed. The silence was suddenly shattered by 3 loud, aggressive knocks on my front door. I checked the peephole. Standing in the hallway, looking utterly disgusted by the faded peeling paint of my apartment complex, were Brittany and Jamal. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just enough to block their entry. Before I could even speak, Jamal pushed his way inside, forcing me to step back. Brittany followed right behind him, holding a designer handbag tight against her chest as if she might catch a disease from breathing the air in my home. They stood in the center of my small living room, casting judgmental glances at my second-hand furniture and the scuffed laminate floors. I crossed my arms, feeling the cold fury from last night harden into solid ice. I demanded to know what they were doing here. Jamal let out a loud theatrical sigh, acting as though he was doing me a massive favor just by showing up. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a checkbook, and scribbled a number with a gold pen. He tore the check loose and tossed it carelessly onto my kitchen counter. It fluttered down, landing next to a stack of unpaid utility bills. Jamal looked at me with an arrogant smirk, adjusting the heavy gold watch on his wrist. He told me there was $500 on that check. He ordered me to go buy some eye drops for the kid, get a coffee, and stop whining about a minor accident. He spoke to me like I was a beggar panhandling on the street. I stared at the piece of paper, then looked back at my brother-in-law. I kept my voice completely flat, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I informed them that the emergency room ophthalmologist diagnosed Leo with severe second-degree chemical burns to his corneas. I told them the toxic garbage Brittany sprayed was composed of industrial solvents, and my son was now facing the very real possibility of permanent vision loss. I told them $500 would not even cover the cost of the ambulance ride, let alone the specialized surgeries he was going to need to save his eyesight. Brittany rolled her eyes dramatically, letting out a sharp scoff. She stepped forward, her face twisting into a nasty sneer. She told me I was always exaggerating for attention, just like when we were kids. She claimed her perfume was perfectly safe and that Leo was just being a fragile, weak little boy who probably rubbed his own eyes too hard. Then her expression darkened, and the true reason for their visit revealed itself. Brittany leaned in close, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. She warned me that if I even thought about going to a lawyer or trying to sue her company for damages, they would destroy me. She threatened to call Child Protective Services that very afternoon. She said she would tell the state investigators that I was a negligent, unfit mother who let her physically disabled son fall and injure himself because I was too busy not paying attention to him. Jamal stepped up right beside her, crossing his muscular arms over his chest to physically intimidate me. He backed up his wife's threat with a cruel smile. He reminded me that he made a fortune in the stock market and retained some of the most ruthless, high-priced corporate lawyers in the entire city. He boasted that his legal team would easily spin the narrative to make it look like I was an unstable, impoverished woman trying to extort her wealthy, successful family for a quick payout. He promised me that by the time his lawyers were finished dragging my name through the mud in family court, the state would permanently strip away my maternal custody rights and Leo would be placed into the foster care system. They were standing in my home promising to take away my injured child if I dared to seek justice for the horrific assault they committed against him. I did not scream or cry. I remained entirely stone-faced, looking at them with a dead, hollow stare that made Brittany shift uncomfortably on her expensive heels. I walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up the check, and slowly ripped it straight down the middle. I tore it again, dropping the shredded pieces onto the floor, right at Jamal's leather shoes. I told them both to get out of my house immediately. Jamal laughed, shaking his head. He told Brittany that some people simply enjoy staying poor and miserable. They walked out, slamming the front door shut behind them, fully believing they had successfully terrified me into permanent submission. As soon as their car engine faded away, I walked over to the bookshelf. I picked up Leo's favorite brown stuffed bear, unzipped a tiny hidden compartment in the back, and pulled out a micro SD card from the nanny camera concealed inside the glass eye. I slid the tiny memory card into my laptop and hit the playback button. The audio and video of their vile extortion attempt and their vicious child custody threat played back with absolute crystal-clear perfection. The long era of quietly taking their abuse was officially over forever. The meticulous financial takedown begins right now. I secured the hidden memory card. It was my first piece of ammunition. My immediate priority, however, was not vengeance. It was Leo. I contacted a pediatric eye specialist in Boston who performed experimental corneal transplant surgeries on chemical burn victims. The doctor reviewed the charts and agreed to take his case. The specialized procedure and extensive aftercare required massive upfront capital. My insurance covered a fraction, leaving me to shoulder a monumental financial burden. My solid corporate salary did not provide that kind of liquid cash. I needed a miracle. I needed my grandfather. My late grandfather established a private trust fund solely in my name. The stipulations were strict. I could not access the principal amount of $500,000 until my 33rd birthday. I turned 33 just 4 months ago. I had purposely left the money untouched, viewing it as a sacred safety net for the future college tuition of my son. But saving his eyesight was the ultimate emergency. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Arthur Harrison, the veteran estate attorney who managed the financial affairs of my grandfather. I explained my urgent situation and requested the immediate transfer of the $500,000 into my primary account. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Mr. Harrison finally spoke, his voice was thick with deep confusion and profound concern. He told me that the trust account was completely empty. He said the entire balance of $500,000 had been fully withdrawn and closed out exactly 3 months ago. I stood frozen in my kitchen, the phone pressed hard against my ear. I asked him how that was mathematically or legally possible. I had never signed a single withdrawal slip. I had never authorized a transfer. Mr. Harrison sounded physically sick as he explained the transaction. He told me that my father Richard and my mother Barbara had come into his private law office. They presented a comprehensive notarized durable power of attorney document. The paperwork claimed I had suffered a severe mental breakdown and legally surrendered control of my finances to my parents. The signatures matched perfectly. They used that forged document to systematically drain every single penny of my inheritance into their own offshore holding accounts. I felt the air leave my lungs. My own parents had stolen $500,000 from me. They fabricated a mental health crisis, forged my signature on federal documents, and robbed my son of his security. I did not scream or cry. The forensic auditor inside my brain completely took over the wheel. I calmly asked Mr. Harrison to email me every piece of documentation related to that transfer, including the forged power of attorney, the withdrawal receipts, and the routing numbers for the receiving accounts. He agreed immediately, promising to launch his own internal fraud investigation. Within 10 minutes, the encrypted files arrived in my inbox. I printed the bank statements and the forged power of attorney. I drove straight to the sprawling estate of my parents, my hands gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. I did not bother knocking. I walked through the unlocked front doors and found my mother Barbara lounging by the indoor swimming pool. She was sipping a mimosa and flipping through a high-fashion magazine, completely unbothered by the fact that she had blinded her grandson and robbed her daughter. I walked right up to her lounge chair and dropped the stack of printed bank statements directly onto the glossy pages of her magazine. I asked her where my $500,000 went. Barbara did not even flinch. She slowly took off her designer sunglasses, looked at the papers, and let out a dismissive sigh. She looked me dead in the eye with a chilling sociopathic calmness. She admitted everything without a single shred of remorse. I took it to buy Jamal a brand new Porsche and pay the 5-year commercial lease for the flagship perfume store of your sister, my mother stated coldly. Brittany is the successful one in this family. She is a rising star with a real brand. She needs that capital to expand her empire. I asked her how she could justify stealing my inheritance while my son lay in a hospital bed, facing permanent blindness. Barbara took a sip of her mimosa and delivered a sentence that sealed her ultimate fate. Throwing money at a crippled kid's hospital bills is a bad investment, she said with a nasty sneer. He is already broken. Why waste $500,000 trying to fix something that will never be perfect? You should be thanking us for putting that money toward a business that actually benefits the legacy of this family. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. I saw no motherly warmth, no human empathy, no soul. I saw nothing but a greedy, hollow parasite who valued a fake organic perfume line over the eyesight of her own flesh and blood. A lesser woman would have slapped her across the face. A weaker woman would have fallen to her knees and begged for the money back. I did neither. I did not utter a single syllable in response to her horrific cruelty. I simply turned around and walked away in absolute silence. My footsteps echoed ghost-like across the marble floors of their massive foyer as I exited the house. I got into my car and started the engine. My mind was no longer clouded by grief or maternal panic. It shifted effortlessly into full corporate assassin mode. They thought they had outsmarted a naive, struggling single mother. They had no idea they just handed a loaded gun to a highly trained financial investigator who destroyed multi-million-dollar fraud rings before her morning coffee. I was going to follow the stolen money, expose the deep rot, and completely dismantle their entire pathetic kingdom piece by piece starting today. I walked into the glass lobby of my corporate headquarters in Manhattan the following morning. My family believed I spent my days entering data into spreadsheets in a dingy cubicle for minimum wage. That was the lie I fed them to keep their greedy hands out of my pockets. The reality was that I occupied a massive corner office on the 42nd floor. As the director of forensic auditing for a top financial firm, My job was to dissect corporate structures, track hidden liabilities, and expose fraud before multi-million-dollar mergers went through. I was the hidden apex predator of the corporate finance world. I walked past the reception desk, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. My assistant handed me my morning coffee and a thick stack of preliminary briefs. I thanked him and walked into my office, dropping my briefcase onto my mahogany desk. The fire from yesterday still burned hot in my chest, but I channeled every single ounce of that rage into razor-sharp, professional focus. I needed to generate capital to fight my parents in court and retrieve my stolen inheritance. I booted up my secure terminal, ready to tear into whatever corporate ledger landed on my desk today. Before I could open my email client, my desk phone buzzed. It was the managing partner of the firm, David. His voice was hushed and serious. He told me to come up to the executive boardroom immediately for a highly classified briefing. I grabbed my tablet and headed up to the penthouse level. The executive boardroom was heavily soundproofed, a secure environment reserved for handling the most sensitive financial transactions on Wall Street. David was standing at the head of the long oak table, looking out at the skyline. Beside him stood two sharply dressed representatives from Vanguard Holdings, a massive multinational conglomerate known for aggressively acquiring regional businesses. David gestured for me to sit. He introduced me to the Vanguard executives as his top forensic investigator, the woman who possessed an unmatched ability to find buried financial skeletons. The Vanguard executives looked at me with serious, calculating expressions. They explained that they were in the final stages of a major acquisition. They were preparing to buy out a mid-sized regional logistics and supply chain company. The proposed buyout price was $50 million. The lead executive from Vanguard leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. He explained that while the logistics company showed excellent outward growth and a highly profitable quarter, their internal risk management team felt uneasy. The numbers looked almost too perfect. They needed an aggressive, completely independent forensic audit of the target company before they signed the final $50 million check. They needed someone to tear through the accounting ledgers, verify the asset valuations, and ensure there were no hidden shell companies or off-the-books liabilities. If the company was clean, the deal would close by the end of the month, making the current owner an incredibly wealthy man. If the company was dirty, Vanguard wanted to know immediately so they could pull the plug and walk away without losing a single dime. David looked at me and stated that this audit required absolute discretion and a relentless eye for detail. He said they needed my specific expertise to either clear the company for acquisition or burn the deal to the ground. He slid a thick black leather dossier across the polished table toward me. The dossier contained the preliminary financial disclosures, the executive summaries, and the ownership structure of the target logistics company. I reached out and pulled the heavy folder closer to me. I flipped open the cover to the first page. My eyes scanned the bold text at the top of the executive summary. The name of the target company was printed in large black letters. It was exactly the same logistics and supply chain company owned and operated by my father. I stared at the page, my heart skipping a beat, as a cold, terrifyingly beautiful realization washed over my entire body. I looked down at the listed owner and chief executive officer, Richard, my father, the man who had just stood in his suburban mansion sipping expensive bourbon while my son screamed in chemical agony, the man who had forged federal documents to steal a $500,000 trust fund from his own daughter just to buy a sports car for his arrogant son-in-law. He was currently attempting to cash out his business, secure $50 million from Vanguard Holdings, and ride off into a luxurious retirement. He thought he was completely untouchable. He thought he was about to secure generational wealth that he would undoubtedly lavish entirely upon Brittany and Jamal. The sheer poetic justice of this specific file landing on my desk was astronomical. The universe had not just handed me an opportunity for vengeance, it had handed me the absolute power of life and death over the entire financial existence of my father. I kept my facial expression completely neutral, masking the absolute predatory joy exploding inside my chest. I looked up from the dossier and met the gaze of the Vanguard executives. I told them I would take the case. However, I laid out one absolute non-negotiable condition for my involvement. I demanded full anonymous control over the entire forensic audit. I explained that in cases involving potential corporate fraud, the target company often tries to charm or intimidate the lead auditor. To prevent any interference, my true identity, my name and my direct contact information had to be completely shielded from the logistics company. They would only know me as an independent third-party auditor representing Vanguard Holdings. I would communicate solely through secure redacted digital channels. David and the Vanguard executives agreed to my terms, instantly praising my uncompromising dedication to objective corporate security. I closed the black leather folder and smiled. I finally had the keys to his castle. I locked the office door, lowered the mechanized blinds, and booted up my secure encrypted workstation. The digital files from Vanguard Holdings provided a direct, unfiltered pipeline into the central nervous system of my father's logistics empire. Richard believed his accounting software was impenetrable, protected by expensive regional accountants who likely looked the other way for a generous bonus. But I was not a regional accountant. I was an apex predator in the digital financial ecosystem. I deployed proprietary forensic algorithms designed to flag inconsistencies, phantom transactions, and offshore routing numbers. Within the first 3 hours of combing through the corporate ledgers, the flawless facade of his highly profitable business began to crumble. The first red flags appeared in the accounts payable department. I found a massive web of wire fraud disguised as international shipping expenses. My father's company was paying exorbitant consulting fees and expedited shipping rates to a series of obscure vendors located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. I cross-referenced the vendor registration numbers against international corporate databases. They were shell companies. The logistics business was not actually moving cargo for these specific clients, it was moving cash. I traced the origin of the incoming funds funneling into these ghost accounts. The money trail led straight back to a private brokerage firm in Manhattan. It was the exact same firm where Jamal worked. The pieces of the criminal puzzle snapped into place with horrifying clarity. Jamal was executing illegal stock trades, likely engaging in insider trading and aggressive pump and dump schemes. To avoid the scrutiny of federal regulators, he could not simply deposit those illicit millions into his own bank accounts. He needed a washing machine. My father provided that washing machine. Jamal funneled his dirty stock market profits into Richard's logistics company under the guise of fictitious shipping contracts. Richard processed the money, took a hefty percentage for his trouble, and paid it back out as clean, legitimate corporate dividends. They were laundering millions of dollars right under the nose of the federal government. This upcoming $50 million buyout from Vanguard Holdings was not a retirement plan. It was an emergency exit strategy. They needed to cash out and vanish before their massive house of cards inevitably collapsed. I downloaded every single fraudulent invoice, wire transfer receipt, and forged shipping manifest backing them up onto a secure offline server. I had enough hard evidence to send both Richard and Jamal to a federal penitentiary for a decade. But I was not finished. To pull off a money laundering operation of this magnitude without triggering automatic alarms at the Internal Revenue Service, Richard needed a way to aggressively offset his massive influx of taxable income. He needed astronomical tax deductions. I switched my focus to the corporate tax filings from the past 3 years. I bypassed the standard operational write-offs and dug into the philanthropic donations sector. Buried deep within the corporate tax returns, I uncovered a registered nonprofit organization acting as a subsidiary under my father's corporate umbrella. The entity was classified as a charity dedicated to funding medical equipment for disabled children. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The registered name of the charity was Helping Little Steps. I bypassed the corporate firewalls and accessed the hidden marketing directories stored on their internal servers. I located the promotional materials, the donation brochures, and the annual gala presentation slides used to solicit funding from wealthy private investors. I clicked on the master PDF file. The document opened on my high-resolution monitor. The breath violently left my lungs. Staring back at me from the glossy digital brochure was my 7-year-old son. It was a photograph of Leo sitting in a hospital bed wearing his leg brace, looking exhausted after one of his previous surgeries. I scrolled frantically through the pages. There were dozens of photos. Pictures of Leo walking with his crutches. Pictures of Leo receiving physical therapy. Pictures I had privately sent to my mother years ago, foolishly believing she actually cared about his medical progress. They had stolen his private, painful medical journey and plastered his face across fraudulent marketing materials. The text beside my son's face begged wealthy donors to open their hearts and their wallets to help crippled children walk again. The financial records attached to the charity were completely fabricated. Not a single cent of the millions of dollars raised had ever gone to a medical facility or a disabled child. The entire charity was a massive tax evasion shield designed to wash Jamal's dirty money and pad my father's pockets. They were parading my child around to their rich country club friends as a tragic charity case to solicit millions in tax-deductible donations. The ultimate betrayal slammed into my chest with the force of a freight train. My mind flashed back to the Thanksgiving dinner. I heard my mother laughing as my son screamed in agony, calling him a burden. I saw my father sipping his bourbon, completely indifferent to his pain. They looked him in the eyes and treated him like garbage, like a useless inconvenience that ruined their aesthetic. But behind closed doors, they were exploiting his physical disability to steal millions of dollars. They were profiting off the very same brokenness they mocked him for. A cold, absolute silence fell heavily over my private office. The rage I felt before was completely gone, replaced by a terrifying surgical clarity. They did not just steal my inheritance, they commodified the suffering of my child. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the stolen photograph of my beautiful, brave boy. I promised him right then and there that I would not just ruin their impending corporate buyout. I was going to tear their lives apart with such absolute, devastating precision that they would never recover. I began compiling the final corporate dossier, fully ready to pull the ultimate trigger. I shut down my encrypted workstation, locked the finalized corporate dossier inside my secure briefcase, and left the towering glass office building behind. The bustling Manhattan streets were a stark contrast to the cold, quiet precision inside my mind. I navigated the heavy evening traffic, my thoughts consumed by the horrific financial web my family had spun using my son as their tragic mascot. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, grabbing my briefcase from the passenger seat. Before heading upstairs, I stopped by the rusted mailboxes lining the first-floor breezeway. I unlocked my box, expecting to find the usual stack of utility notices and mounting hospital bills from the emergency room visit. Instead, my fingers brushed against something thick and heavy. I pulled out a large envelope made of premium textured cardstock. It was completely out of place among the cheap white envelopes of my bills. The address was written in elegant calligraphy, and the seal on the back was stamped in actual wax. I walked up the stairs to my apartment, turning the envelope over in my hands. The return address belonged to an elite event planning firm known for organizing million-dollar corporate galas and high society weddings. I unlocked my front door, set my briefcase on the entryway table, and tore the wax seal open. Inside was a lavish gold foil invitation that practically reeked of the ostentatious taste my mother possessed. The thick cursive font shimmered under the hallway light. It was an exclusive invitation to a massive dual-purpose celebration at one of the most expensive luxury hotels in the city. The first half of the evening was dedicated to the grand launch of the new flagship perfume store owned by Brittany, the exact same business funded by my stolen inheritance. The second half of the gala was a formal celebration of the impending $50 million corporate buyout rewarding Richard. They were throwing themselves a massive coronation to celebrate the wealth they had stolen and the money they were about to launder. I stared at the gleaming gold foil, shaking my head at their sheer audacity. They were hosting a party to celebrate a corporate merger that I was currently auditing. They had no idea the person holding the axe of the executioner was standing in a cheap apartment holding their shiny invitation. As I slipped the card back into the envelope, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. I bent down and picked it up. It was a bright pink sticky note, and I immediately recognized the loopy, arrogant handwriting of my sister Brittany. I read the words written in black ink, and a fresh wave of absolute disgust washed over me. The note read, "Come see what real success looks like. Just make sure to leave the kid at home. We do not want him ruining the aesthetic." I read the vicious sentences twice, letting the sheer malice of her words sink deep into my bones. Brittany had permanently scarred the corneas of my son with her toxic chemical spray, and her only concern was that his physical presence might ruin the visual vibe of her luxury party. She viewed my child as a repulsive accessory that did not fit her wealthy lifestyle brand. I crumpled the pink sticky note in my fist, my knuckles turning white. I walked down the short hallway and peeked into the bedroom where my son slept. Leo was fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The thick white medical bandages still covered his eyes, a glaring reminder of the agonizing pain he endured on Thanksgiving. His metal leg brace rested on the floor beside his bed. He was so brave, so incredibly strong, enduring physical challenges every single day without ever complaining. He was worth 1,000,000,000 times more than the shallow, soulless people who shared our last name. I stood in his doorway for a long moment, letting the protective maternal rage fuse with my cold, calculating professional focus. I stepped back quietly, pulling his door shut, and walked into my small home office. The room was sparsely furnished, dominated by a large corkboard covering the entire back wall. Over the past 24 hours, I had turned that board into a massive interconnected map of financial crimes. It looked like the workspace of a federal investigator tracking a mafia syndicate. Printed photographs of Richard, Barbara, Jamal, and Brittany were pinned across the top. Below them were the fraudulent tax returns, the forged power of attorney documents, and the offshore bank statements tracing the illegal stock market profits of Jamal through the logistics company owned by Richard. Red string connected the fake charity Helping Little Steps directly to the Cayman Island shell accounts. I had printed the stolen hospital photos of Leo from their promotional brochure and pinned them next to the withdrawal slips showing my $500,000 trust fund being drained. Every piece of their criminal enterprise was laid out, fully documented, and ready to be handed over to the federal authorities. I walked up to the center of the board, holding the lavish gold foil invitation in my hand. This party was their victory lap. It was the moment they planned to solidify their stolen wealth and secure their status among the elite. They wanted me there to gloat, to force me to watch them enjoy their deceit while my son suffered in the dark. I drove a red pushpin straight through the center of the gold foil invitation, mounting it in the middle of my financial murder board. It was no longer just an invitation. It was the designated time and place for their total destruction. I smoothed out the crumpled pink sticky note from Brittany and pinned it right next to the invitation. I stood back, taking a deep breath. The endgame was finally here. They had no idea about the hurricane heading toward their perfect lives. The following morning required a performance worthy of an Academy Award. I stripped away my usual tailored corporate suits and pulled a faded oversized sweater from the back of my closet. I purposely avoided putting on any makeup, letting the dark circles under my eyes show the full extent of my simulated exhaustion. I tied my hair into a messy, defeated knot. I needed to look exactly like the broken, helpless woman my family desperately wanted me to be. I drove my modest sedan to the towering glass and steel headquarters of my father's logistics company. The building stood as a monument to the illegal wealth he had accumulated. I walked through the sliding glass doors and approached the front desk, keeping my shoulders slumped and my gaze lowered. The receptionist gave me a dismissive look before dialing my father's office. After a brief murmured conversation, she told me he could spare exactly 5 minutes for me. I rode the elevator to the top floor, stepping out onto plush carpeting that absorbed the sound of my worn-out shoes. I pushed open the heavy oak door to his executive suite. Richard was sitting behind a massive desk imported from Italy, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my monthly rent. He did not bother to stand or offer me a seat. He simply steepled his fingers and stared at me with an expression of profound irritation, as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into his pristine sanctuary. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let tears well up in my eyes, a trick I had learned during my teenage years just to survive in their household. I stepped forward, clasping my hands together tightly in a display of total submission. I told him I had nowhere else to turn. I explained that the pediatric eye specialist in Boston required an immediate upfront payment for the experimental corneal transplant to save the vision of my son. I let a sob break my voice, begging him for a $20,000 loan. I promised I would pay him back every single cent with interest. I swore I would take on a second job and work night shifts just to make the payments. I pleaded with him to remember that Leo was his grandson, his own flesh and blood, and that without this surgery, the little boy would live the rest of his life in absolute darkness. Richard watched my tearful breakdown with cold, calculating eyes. He did not show a single ounce of empathy or parental concern. Instead, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair and let out a harsh, echoing laugh. The sound bounced off the glass walls of his office, dripping with condescension and pure malice. He told me that my sob stories were getting incredibly old. He mocked my desperation, stating that asking for $20,000 was a bold move for someone who could barely afford to dress herself properly. He stood up, walked over to a polished mahogany filing cabinet, and pulled out a manila folder. He tossed it onto his desk with a heavy thud. He told me he knew I would eventually come crawling back for a handout. He said he was a businessman, and businessmen do not give out loans to terrible investments without securing collateral. He opened the folder and slid a thick legal document across the desk toward me. I looked down at the paper, letting my hands tremble violently to maintain the illusion of my total defeat. Richard placed a heavy gold pen right next to the contract. He laid out his cruel bargain with chilling precision. He told me the document contained two very specific clauses. The first clause was a total irrevocable relinquishment of any and all future claims to the trust fund established by my late grandfather. The second clause was a strict, legally binding non-disclosure agreement regarding the Perfume accident involving Brittany. The contract explicitly stated that the chemical burn was a completely unavoidable, unforeseeable household accident, and I would forever forfeit my right to pursue any civil litigation, criminal charges, or public statements against his golden child. Richard leaned across the desk, invading my personal space. He told me that $20,000 was entirely out of the question. He offered me $10,000 instead. He stated it was a generous payout for a disabled kid who was never going to amount to much anyway. He said I could take the $10,000, sign the papers, and walk out of his office right now, or I could leave empty-handed and watch my son go permanently blind. "Take it or leave it," he demanded, tapping the gold pen against the dotted line. I stared at the contract, allowing a few tears to spill over my eyelashes and drop onto the collar of my faded sweater. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with manufactured terror and absolute submission. I whispered that $10,000 was not enough to cover the specialized aftercare Leo would need. Richard rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by my bargaining attempt. He told me I should have thought about the financial burdens of motherhood before having a child I could not afford to fix. He crossed his arms and looked at the clock on his wall, reminding me that my 5 minutes were almost up. He thought he had me completely trapped. He thought he had successfully blackmailed a desperate mother into signing away a $500,000 inheritance and providing blanket legal immunity for a horrific assault, all for a pathetic fraction of what the surgery actually cost. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, playing three-dimensional chess, while I was begging for scraps on the floor. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy gold pen. I looked at Richard once again. I lowered my eyes and let out a defeated sigh. The gold pen felt cold against my skin. With intentional shaky strokes, I signed my name at the bottom of the extortion contract. I filled out the date, initialed every page, and signed the final line relinquishing my rights to the $500,000 trust fund. I also signed the non-disclosure agreement ensuring my silence regarding the chemical assault on my son. I pushed the signed papers back across the polished mahogany desk. Richard snatched the contract with a triumphant grin. He quickly reviewed my signatures, ensuring I had not missed a single line. Satisfied, he opened his drawer, pulled out a checkbook, and wrote a check for $10,000. He ripped it from the binding and tossed it casually toward me. It fluttered across the desk, stopping just short of my hands. I picked it up, folded it carefully, and placed it into my worn purse. Just as I prepared to stand, the heavy oak door swung open. Jamal strolled into the executive suite, looking like he owned the entire building. He wore a sharp suit and a smug expression that made my skin crawl. He took one look at my tear-stained face and the signed contract on the desk, and an arrogant smile spread across his features. He walked to the private bar cart in the corner and poured 2 glasses of expensive bourbon. He handed a glass to Richard and raised his own in a mock toast. He declared it a fantastic morning for family business. He looked down at me, shaking his head with exaggerated pity. He told me I was the most pathetic woman he had ever met. He laughed openly, stating my grandfather must be rolling in his grave, knowing his precious trust fund was drained to pay for a sports car and a luxury retail lease. Richard chuckled, taking a sip of bourbon. He agreed with Jamal, adding the money was better suited for people who actually knew how to multiply wealth, rather than a struggling single mother who could not protect her child from a simple household accident. Jamal leaned against the mahogany desk, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He told me I sold my soul incredibly cheap today. He mocked the $10,000 payout, calling it absolute pocket change. He bragged that he made twice that amount before lunch on a slow trading day. He warned me to take the miserable scraps they gave me, fix my little boy, and never show my face around their upscale neighborhood again. He stated the legal contract meant they essentially owned me. If I ever breathed a single word about Brittany spraying toxic chemicals into the face of my son, his corporate lawyers would absolutely bury me in court fees until I was living on the street. I kept my head bowed, playing the role of the utterly crushed victim until the bitter end. I stood up from the chair, clutching my purse tightly against my chest. I whispered a quiet thank you, making my voice tremble perfectly. I turned around and walked toward the heavy oak door. Their cruel, echoing laughter followed me out of the executive suite. They truly believed they had achieved a flawless victory. I walked down the plush-carpeted hallway and stepped into the empty elevator. The polished metal doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of the logistics headquarters. The second the elevator began its descent, my entire physical posture transformed. The slumped shoulders straightened. The manufactured terror in my eyes completely vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp, and highly dangerous focus. I reached up and wiped the fake tears from my cheeks. I lifted my left wrist and looked at my watch. It was not a cheap department store accessory. It was a state-of-the-art, highly encrypted micro-recording device, routinely utilized in federal forensic sting operations. I tapped the disguise side button twice to halt the recording. I pulled a small wireless earpiece from my pocket, synced it to the watch, and pressed playback. The audio quality was absolutely breathtaking. Every single word spoken in that office was captured with crystal-clear precision. I listened to Richard explicitly admit to stealing the trust fund. I listened to Jamal brag about the stolen money buying his sports car. I listened to their explicit, undeniable threats of legal extortion and their full confession regarding the chemical assault committed by Brittany. They thought the contract they forced me to sign was an impenetrable shield. They did not realize that a contract signed under documented duress and explicit extortion is entirely void under federal law. Instead of protecting them, that document was now the physical proof of their criminal conspiracy. I smiled as the elevator reached the ground floor. I walked out of the building with the purposeful stride of a woman holding a royal flush. I got into my car and drove directly to a specialized financial institution downtown. I did not take the $10,000 check to my personal bank to pay for the upcoming medical bills of my son. I had already secured the funding for his experimental corneal surgery by liquidating my own aggressive stock portfolio, which my family knew absolutely nothing about. Instead, I walked into the bank and approached a private wealth manager I trusted. I handed over the check signed by my father. I instructed the manager to deposit the $10,000 directly into a heavily restricted escrow account specifically designated for impending legal warfare. By routing the funds into a legal escrow, rather than cashing it for personal use, I preserved the check as an untainted piece of physical criminal evidence. It was the documented payoff for their extortion scheme. Every single move they made to crush me only handed me more devastating ammunition. The trap was now fully armed and heavily loaded. The financial destruction of my corrupt family began. I returned to my apartment and walked straight to a small locked safe in my hallway closet. Inside rested a sealed plastic evidence bag holding the prototype bottle of perfume my sister had sprayed into the eyes of my son. In the chaotic aftermath of the Thanksgiving assault, amidst the screaming and the cruel laughter of my parents, my professional instincts had automatically kicked in. Before scooping Leo off the floor, I had snatched the dropped bottle from the Persian rug and shoved it deep into my coat pocket. Brittany was too busy complaining about the wine stains on her silk dress to notice her weapon was missing. I placed the glass bottle into a heavily padded shipping box and sent it via overnight courier to an independent, highly credentialed toxicology laboratory in New Jersey. I paid a premium for expedited priority testing. I requested a full chemical breakdown of every single compound inside that liquid. 3 days later, the certified lab results arrived in my secure inbox. The chemical composition was absolutely horrifying. Brittany was marketing her new line as a pure botanical organic beauty experience designed for sensitive skin. The lab report proved the liquid was an abrasive cocktail of cheap industrial solvents, synthetic cutting agents, and highly restricted phthalates. The acidity level was staggering. It contained volatile compounds legally banned in commercial cosmetics due to their severe corrosive properties. It was essentially a bottle of toxic waste dressed up in pink glass and gold lettering. The laboratory director attached a personal note stating the liquid was so hazardous it required specialized protective gear just to handle during the testing phase. I compiled the certified toxicology report, the horrific medical records, detailing the second-degree corneal burns my son suffered, and the marketing claims Brittany had published online. I structured the evidence into a meticulous, devastating, formal complaint. I forwarded the entire package directly to the top enforcement directors at the Food and Drug Administration and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I flagged the submission as an imminent public health crisis, ensuring it would bypass the lower-level bureaucrats and land directly on the desks of federal agents who had the authority to issue immediate arrest warrants. With the destruction of my sister set firmly into motion, I turned my absolute focus back to the financial obliteration of my father and my arrogant brother-in-law. I locked myself inside my home office for an entire weekend, fueled by black coffee and the memory of my mother laughing at my agonizing child. I pulled the encrypted data I had harvested from the logistics company servers and began constructing the ultimate whistleblower dossier. The final document was exactly 500 pages of irrefutable, undeniable financial treason. I organized the evidence into clear chronological chapters. Chapter 1 detailed the elaborate network of offshore shell companies my father created in the Cayman Islands. Chapter 2 contained the wire transfer logs, proving Jamal was funneling millions in illegal stock market profits directly into those fake shipping accounts. Chapter 3 was the final nail in their coffins. It outlined the despicable tax evasion scheme hiding behind the fake charity named Helping Little Steps. I included the fraudulent tax returns alongside the promotional brochures featuring the stolen hospital photographs of my disabled son. I cross-referenced every single illegal transaction with federal banking statutes, making the job of the federal prosecutors incredibly easy. I basically handed them a fully completed grand jury indictment wrapped in a neat digital bow. Once the massive dossier was finalized, I established a secure, untraceable virtual private network connection. I addressed the submission to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Timing was the most critical element of my entire operation. I did not want the federal agents showing up at their corporate offices on a random Tuesday morning. I wanted maximum visibility, maximum public humiliation, and absolute psychological destruction. I accessed the digital invitation for the upcoming gala, the dual celebration for the Perfume brand launch, and the $50 million corporate buyout. I programmed my secure server to transmit the 500-page dossier and the audio recording of their extortion attempt exactly 48 hours before the luxury party. That specific timing would give the federal task force just enough time to verify the financial evidence, secure the necessary arrest warrants from a federal judge, and mobilize their tactical raid teams. They would be forced to execute the warrants right as the celebration reached its peak. The trap was perfectly set. I had successfully weaponized the federal government against my own family. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the completed files on my glowing monitor. The level of meticulous detail I applied to this takedown was staggering. Every single lie they told, every penny they stole, and every act of cruelty they committed was meticulously documented and sent to the highest authorities in the nation. They thought they could hurt my son and simply buy their way out of the consequences. They underestimated the quiet, observant daughter they had discarded so many years ago. I closed the laptop and walked out of my office, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The heavy burden of fear and helplessness I carried since Thanksgiving was entirely gone. I was no longer a victim hiding from their immense power. I was the architect of their absolute ruin. The Food and Drug Administration was going to dismantle the fraudulent business my sister built, exposing her as a dangerous scam artist. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were going to freeze every single bank account my father and brother-in-law possessed. The carefully constructed facade of their wealthy elite lifestyle was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of cold water. Everything was proceeding perfectly. The ultimate countdown to their public execution officially began. The morning of the surgery arrived with a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I drove Leo to the Specialized Pediatric Eye Institute in Boston before the sun even breached the horizon. I had liquidated a significant portion of my actual savings, the aggressive stock portfolio my family knew nothing about, to cover the astronomical upfront medical costs. I did not care about the money. I would have gladly emptied every single account I possessed, sold my car, and mortgaged my future for 100 years to save my little boy. We walked into the pristine, brightly lit lobby of the hospital. Leo squeezed my hand tightly. He was remarkably brave, but I could feel the tiny tremors radiating through his small fingers. I knelt down on the polished floor, looked at his bandaged face, and promised him that he was in the best possible hands. I told him that when he woke up, the burning pain would be gone forever. I swore to him that he would never have to feel that kind of unimaginable, agonizing torture ever again in his entire life. I was going to protect him. Nurses wheeled him away through heavy double doors, leaving me standing completely alone in the sterile waiting room. The next 4 hours were pure, unfiltered agony. I paced the floor, staring blankly at the daytime television playing on mute in the corner. Every time the door opened, my heart leaped into my throat. I replayed the terrible moments from Thanksgiving in my head over and over again. I thought about how close I came to losing his beautiful smile, his fierce independence, and his ability to see the world clearly. My family had treated his severe physical pain as a cruel punchline. They had laughed while his corneas burned from toxic chemicals. They had refused to help him, then actively tried to extort me when I desperately sought the funds to heal him. I channeled that dark, visceral memory to keep myself grounded while the surgical team operated on my son. I absolutely refused to let the anxiety break me down. I had to remain exceptionally strong for him and incredibly sharp for the fierce battle to come. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and waited. Finally, the heavy wooden doors swung open. The lead pediatric ophthalmologist stepped into the waiting area. He pulled off his blue surgical cap, his face lined with deep exhaustion, but carrying a bright, genuine smile. He walked over to me and delivered the absolute greatest news of my entire life. He announced that the highly delicate procedure was a massive, unprecedented success. The experimental corneal transplant had taken perfectly to the eye tissues. He explained that they had successfully removed the damaged, chemically scorched tissue and replaced it with flawless surgical precision. He assured me with absolute medical certainty that Leo would recover completely. His vision would be fully restored without any permanent scarring or long-term visual deficits. I collapsed into the nearest chair, letting out a jagged, breathless sob of pure, profound relief. The oppressive terror that had been crushing my chest for weeks evaporated instantly. My sweet son was going to be okay. He was going to see again. I thanked the doctor repeatedly, crying tears of joy. A kind nurse led me back into the quiet recovery ward. Leo was lying in a small hospital bed surrounded by advanced medical monitors, beeping in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Fresh, clean bandages covered his eyes, but his breathing was deep and peaceful. I pulled a chair right up to the edge of his mattress and sat down. I reached out and gently took his small, warm hand in mine. I traced the knuckles of his fingers, feeling an overwhelming wave of powerful maternal love wash over me. He stirred slightly, murmuring my name in his sleep. I leaned in close, resting my forehead against his arm. I kissed his hand and let a single tear drop onto the white hospital blanket. I looked at his resting face and made a silent vow to protect him from every monster in the world, especially the ones who shared our blood. I leaned close to his ear and whispered gently, "Tomorrow, Mommy is taking out the trash." I promised him a safe future. Leaving Leo in the capable hands of the overnight nursing staff, I drove back to my apartment to prepare for the final execution. The gala was less than 24 hours away. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet doors. I bypassed the faded sweaters and the cheap blouses I usually wore around my parents. I reached into the very back and pulled out a protective garment bag. Inside was my armor. It was a custom-tailored charcoal gray designer power suit. The cut was sharp, aggressive, and commanded absolute immediate authority. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and black stiletto heels that sounded like gunshots when I walked. I laid the outfit across my bed, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles. I spent an hour steaming the fabric until it was flawless. This was the uniform of the apex predator my family never knew existed. I stood up straight and looked at my reflection in the mirror, my eyes hard and unyielding. The terrified, submissive daughter they abused was completely dead. Tomorrow night I would walk into their luxury ballroom and tear their stolen empire down to the very last brick. I was going to ruin their entire existence. I was going to make sure they lost everything they valued. Their money, their social standing, their fake reputation, and their freedom would all be stripped away. I smiled at my reflection, feeling a terrifying sense of absolute peace. The storm was finally here, and I was the one bringing the lightning. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you push a mother into a corner. They would not survive the consequences of their actions. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Royale Hotel was a monument to excessive wealth and unearned arrogance. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the absolute worst people in the city. The room was packed with local politicians, wealthy socialites, and aggressive corporate investors. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated the crowded floor, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne and delicate appetizers. A string quartet played classical music in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to a room completely filled with thieves and liars. The floral arrangements alone likely cost more than the average American makes in a single year. Massive pillars of white roses and orchids framed the main stage where a large mahogany desk sat waiting. This was the exact spot where my father planned to sign away his corrupt logistics empire for $50 million. Near the entrance, a temporary red carpet and a branded backdrop had been set up to accommodate the local media and lifestyle influencers. Brittany stood directly in the center of the flashing cameras, absolutely soaking up the unearned adoration. She wore a floor-length emerald green designer gown that hugged her figure, a dress undoubtedly purchased with the trust fund money stolen from my grandfather. She smiled brightly for a reporter holding a microphone, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. I could hear her sharp melodic voice echoing across the foyer as she proudly discussed the launch of her new flagship perfume store. She looked directly into the camera lens and lied without a single ounce of hesitation. She claimed her new beauty line was entirely pure, completely botanical, and formulated with only the highest quality organic ingredients sourced from sustainable farms. She spoke passionately about her dedication to clean beauty and consumer safety. It was a sickening performance. She was actively promoting a toxic chemical solvent that had burned the corneas of her own nephew just weeks prior, yet she stood there acting like a visionary pioneer of health and wellness. Across the ballroom, my father Richard was working the crowd with practiced ease. He held a glass of his signature expensive bourbon in one hand, using the other to aggressively shake hands with city councilmen and regional banking executives. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, projecting the image of a titan of industry who had built a massive fortune through sheer grit and honest hard work. He laughed loudly at a joke made by one of the Vanguard Holdings representatives, patting the man on the back with aggressive familiarity. Richard was completely in his element, surrounded by sycophants who admired his apparent business acumen. He kept glancing toward the main stage, his eyes locking onto the mahogany desk where the $50 million acquisition papers rested inside a leather binder. He looked like a man who believed he had successfully cheated the universe. Standing right beside Richard was Jamal, playing the role of the loyal and highly successful son-in-law. Jamal wore a velvet dinner jacket and flashed his heavy gold watch every time he gestured. He leaned in close to my father, whispering something that made them both chuckle darkly. They were likely congratulating themselves on their brilliant money laundering operation and the fake charity scam that was about to pay off in a massive, untraceable windfall. They were celebrating their absolute immunity. They believed the police were in their pockets, the federal regulators were blind to their offshore accounts, and the annoying, impoverished single mother of the family had been permanently silenced with a pathetic $10,000 bribe. They stood at the absolute pinnacle of their fraudulent kingdom, utterly blind to the massive wrecking ball swinging directly toward their heads. I stepped out of the private elevator and walked down the long, carpeted corridor leading to the ballroom entrance. I did not rush. I moved with the slow, deliberate, and terrifying grace of a predator that has completely cornered its prey. The heavy oak doors to the ballroom were propped wide open, spilling light and music out into the hallway. I paused for a fraction of a second, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored charcoal gray power suit. The fabric fell perfectly against my frame, radiating a quiet, dangerous luxury that commanded immediate respect. My crisp white silk blouse was buttoned precisely, and my black stiletto heels struck the marble border of the entryway with a sharp, authoritative crack. I did not look like the exhausted, defeated woman who had cried in my father's office. I looked exactly like what I was. I was the director of forensic auditing, and I was here to execute a corporate slaughter. I stepped through the doors and entered the ballroom. The shift in the atmosphere was almost instantaneous. The bright, chaotic energy of the high society party seemed to falter the second I crossed the threshold. It started near the entrance. A group of wealthy investors stopped their conversation, their eyes drawn to the commanding presence radiating from my posture. The silence began to ripple outward, like a stone dropped into a quiet pond. I did not look around nervously. I kept my chin high, my posture rigidly straight, and my eyes locked onto the main stage. I walked smoothly across the room, the sharp clicks of my heels cutting through the fading chatter. People instinctively stepped out of my way, parting like the Red Sea. They did not know who I was, but they immediately recognized that I possessed a terrifying amount of power. I was not there to mingle, drink champagne, or offer polite congratulations. I was a highly weaponized professional carrying the absolute destruction of their hosts in my mind. The air in the room grew cold thick with sudden, unexplained tension as I marched directly toward the center of the absolute worst night of their entire lives. I was completely prepared. The absolute execution begins right now. As I continued my deliberate march across the grand ballroom, the sea of wealthy guests continued to part before me. The sudden hush in the room finally caught the attention of my mother. Barbara was standing near a towering display of white orchids, laughing falsely at a joke told by a local socialite. I watched her perfectly sculpted face shift as she noticed the guests staring in my direction. Her eyes tracked the invisible path clearing through the crowd and finally landed on me. The transformation was instantaneous and entirely predictable. The elegant, refined matriarch persona she had spent decades cultivating evaporated in a fraction of a second. It was immediately replaced by the ugly, venomous sneer I had endured for my entire life. She excused herself from the wealthy socialite with a tight, forced smile and began power walking directly toward me. Her designer gown swished aggressively around her ankles. She looked like a predator moving in to eliminate a threat, completely unaware that she was actually marching straight into a trap. I did not slow my pace or alter my trajectory. I let her close the distance between us. Barbara stepped directly into my path, physically blocking my route to the main stage. Her face was flushed dark red with pure, unfiltered fury. The veins in her neck stood out sharply against her heavy diamond necklace. She leaned in close, her voice a harsh, venomous hiss designed to remain unheard by the surrounding guests. "Are you here to beg for food?" she demanded, her eyes raking over my tailored suit with absolute disgust. She did not recognize the exquisite craftsmanship of the fabric or the pristine cut of the design. To her, I was simply the pathetic, impoverished outcast who had dared to crash her glorious evening. "Get out before I call security." She threatened, her manicured finger pointing aggressively toward the heavy oak doors I had just walked through. "You are completely ruining the aesthetic of this gala. You have absolutely no right to be here. This is a closed event for successful people." Before I could even register her pathetic attempt at intimidation, a second figure stepped into my peripheral vision. Jamal sauntered over from the bar area, casually swirling a fresh glass of champagne. He wore his velvet dinner jacket like a royal cape, exuding the smug, unearned arrogance of a man who believed his financial crimes made him a genius. He placed a heavy hand on the bare shoulder of my mother, acting as her arrogant protector. He looked me up and down, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his face. "Well, look who decided to crawl out of the slums," Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you Uber here or take the bus?" He chuckled at his own terrible joke, taking a slow sip of his expensive champagne. He leaned closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You really have some nerve showing up to a $50 million party, looking like you just got off a shift at a discount office supply store," he sneered. "Take your $10,000 and crawl back under your rock before I have my guys physically throw you out onto the street." They stood together, a united front of extreme cruelty and limitless arrogance. They expected me to shrink back. They expected my shoulders to slump, my eyes to well up with tears, and my voice to tremble with shame. They anticipated the broken, submissive woman who had signed their extortion contract just a few days prior. But that woman was a carefully constructed illusion. The person standing before them now was a highly weaponized financial auditor holding a loaded gun to the head of their entire criminal empire. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground with the absolute, terrifying stillness of a predator assessing its prey. I looked deeply into the eyes of my mother. I saw the exact same woman who had laughed hysterically while toxic chemicals burned the corneas of my beautiful disabled son. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The maternal bond was entirely dead and buried. My heart was completely encased in solid ice. I let the silence stretch between us for 5 agonizing seconds. The surrounding guests were pretending not to watch, but every single eye in our vicinity was locked onto the confrontation. Barbara began to look uncertain, her aggressive posture faltering slightly under my dead, hollow stare. I kept my voice incredibly calm, perfectly level, and loud enough for the closest investors to hear every single syllable. "Clearly, I am not here as your daughter," I stated, enunciating each word with surgical precision. The blood instantly drained from the face of my mother. She took a tiny, involuntary step backward, sensing the massive shift in the power dynamic. I kept my gaze locked onto hers, completely ignoring the arrogant posturing of my brother-in-law. "I am here as the executioner," I said coldly. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy as a guillotine blade. Jamal opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came. "Out." The mocking smile completely vanished from his face. Barbara stood paralyzed, her mouth slightly open in sheer disbelief. They were entirely defenseless against a version of me they had never encountered before. I did not wait for them to recover their wits. I simply stepped forward, driving my shoulder directly between the two of them. I brushed past my mother and my brother-in-law with the exact same dismissive indifference one might show to a minor piece of furniture. I left them standing completely frozen in the middle of the ballroom, their fragile egos shattered by my absolute refusal to submit to their abuse. I resumed my relentless, calculated march toward the main stage, fully prepared to destroy their entire empire tonight. The absolute execution begins right now and forever. I left my mother and brother-in-law frozen in the center of the ballroom and closed the remaining distance to the main stage. The raised platform was elegantly decorated with cascading floral arrangements and flanked by 2 massive projection screens displaying the logos of Vanguard Holdings and my father's logistics company, which he had spent his entire life building into a fragile empire of lies. In the center of the stage sat a heavy mahogany desk imported specifically for this ceremonial signing. Richard was already seated behind it, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He held a custom-engraved fountain pen, posing for a few early photographs, with his signature arrogant grin, while completely ignoring the massive crowd. Standing next to the desk was David, the managing partner of my firm, along with the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. The CEO held a cordless microphone, waiting for the room to settle down so the formal acquisition could begin. I reached the side steps of the stage and stood in the shadows just out of sight. I gave a subtle, calculated nod to David. He caught my eye and immediately tapped the shoulder of the CEO. It was time to spring the trap. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The low hum of wealthy guests chatting and laughing faded into a hushed, expectant silence. All eyes immediately turned toward the brilliantly lit stage. The CEO of Vanguard Holdings stepped slowly forward and raised the microphone. He projected a commanding, booming voice that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. He thanked everyone for attending this momentous celebration. He spoke briefly about the aggressive expansion strategy of Vanguard and how the logistics company built by Richard appeared to be the perfect regional asset to absorb into their massive multinational portfolio. The crowd erupted into polite, restrained applause. Richard beamed with absolute pride, raising his hand to acknowledge the adulation of the local politicians and business elites. He looked down at the leather binder on the desk, fully believing he was seconds away from securing $50 million. He clicked the cap off his fountain pen, ready to sign the final pages. But the CEO raised his free hand to halt the applause. He looked down at Richard with a perfectly neutral business expression. He announced that Vanguard Holdings takes corporate compliance and financial transparency incredibly seriously. He stated that a $50 million acquisition requires an absolutely flawless bill of financial health. Therefore, he explained, before a single signature can be put to paper tonight, Vanguard requires the final public authorization of their lead investigator. The CEO turned toward the side of the stage. He spoke clearly into the microphone, announcing that he needed to bring up their director of forensic auditing, the woman who possessed absolute final approval over this $50 million deal. The spotlight shifted instantly, illuminating the short staircase leading up to the platform. I stepped out of the shadows and began my ascent. The steady, rhythmic click of my stiletto heels against the wooden steps echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. I walked onto the brightly lit stage, my charcoal gray suit commanding the attention of every single investor in the room. I walked past the CEO, offering him a brief professional nod. I stepped right up to the mahogany desk and looked down at my father. The physical reaction from my family was a masterpiece of human panic. Richard froze completely. The expensive fountain pen slipped slightly in his grip, the nib hovering just a fraction of an inch above the signature line. His face lost all its color, turning a sickly ashen gray. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, his brain entirely unable to process the visual information it was receiving. He recognized his daughter, the woman he thought was a broke, desperate single mother standing on a corporate stage acting as an elite financial auditor. Down on the ballroom floor, the reaction was equally catastrophic. I could see Barbara standing near the floral pillars. She let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in absolute horror. Jamal, who had just spent the last 5 minutes mocking my financial status, went completely rigid. The crystal champagne glass slipped right through his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crash, shattering into a dozen pieces, but he did not even flinch. He just stared at the stage in sheer, unadulterated terror. Brittany stopped posing for the lifestyle photographers. Her jaw dropped open, her emerald green dress suddenly looking ridiculous as she realized the spotlight had completely abandoned her. They were all trapped in a synchronized state of profound shock. They had spent my entire life underestimating me, abusing me, and pushing me into the dark shadows. They thought I was weak. They thought I was stupid. Now they were staring directly at the architect of their impending destruction. I did not offer my father a warm smile. I did not greet him as family. I reached out and gently took the heavy cordless microphone from the extended hand of the Vanguard CEO. I stood tall at the center podium, commanding the absolute attention of the entire crowded ballroom. I raised my left hand and tapped the top of the microphone twice with my index finger. The sharp, amplified thumping sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers, snapping Richard out of his paralyzed trance. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand a fast explanation, to try and assert his parental dominance one last desperate time. I did not give him the chance to utter a single word. I stared directly into his terrified eyes, my voice projecting crisp and cold over the high-fidelity sound system. "Hello, Richard," I said smoothly, my voice lacking even a single shred of daughterly affection. "Let us talk about your books." I watched his chest stop moving as he stopped breathing entirely. The corporate execution was officially underway. Richard tried to stammer out a response, but his throat seized completely. He looked desperately at the Vanguard executives, trying to silently plead for an intervention, but they remained firmly planted on the side of the stage, their faces carved from solid stone. They knew exactly what was about to happen. I turned my attention away from my hyperventilating father and looked out over the massive sea of wealthy guests. I raised my left hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the audiovisual technicians stationed in the elevated sound booth at the back of the ballroom. I had visited them an hour before the gala began, handing over a highly encrypted flash drive with very specific instructions on exactly when to execute the visual display. The technological transition was instantaneous and entirely flawless. The massive high-definition projection screens flanking the mahogany desk flickered once. The polished corporate logo of my father's logistics company vanished completely. In its place, the raw, unfiltered reality of his criminal empire was broadcast in 10-foot-tall letters for every single politician, investor, and socialite in the room to read. Gasps echoed across the ballroom as the first slide materialized brightly. It was not a celebratory video montage detailing the history of a successful family business. It was a highly detailed, meticulously highlighted spreadsheet exposing millions of dollars in illegal offshore wire transfers. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice slicing effortlessly through the rising murmurs of the stunned crowd. I directed their attention to the screens, explaining that what they were currently looking at was a massive, sophisticated money laundering operation. I pointed out the specific routing numbers, linking the logistics company directly to a network of untraceable shell corporations located in the Cayman Islands. I walked across the stage, my heels clicking loudly, and gestured toward the second slide. This document explicitly linked those offshore accounts to the private brokerage firm where my brother-in-law Jamal worked. I announced to the room that Jamal had been funneling his illicit stock market profits into this logistics company, using fake shipping invoices to wash the dirty money and pay it back out as clean corporate dividends. Down on the floor, the crowd physically backed away from Jamal. The wealthy elite who had just been clinking champagne glasses with him suddenly treated him like he was highly radioactive. Jamal staggered backward, his face sweating profusely, searching desperately for an exit that did not exist. I turned my focus back to my father. He was gripping the edge of the mahogany desk so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was silently begging me to stop, his eyes pleading for a mercy he had never once shown me or my child. I ignored his pathetic stare and signaled for the next slide. The screen shifted again. This time, the complex financial ledgers were replaced by the glossy full-color promotional brochure for the fake charity known as Helping Little Steps. A collective gasp of genuine horror rippled through the audience. Displayed on the massive screens was the stolen photograph of my 7-year-old son Leo sitting in his hospital bed wearing his heavy leg brace. I felt a massive surge of protective maternal rage heat my blood, but I kept my voice absolutely clinical and detached. I explained to the room that to offset the massive influx of illegal cash, Richard had created a fraudulent nonprofit organization dedicated to disabled children. I stated that he had stolen private medical photographs of his own disabled grandson to solicit tax-deductible donations from wealthy investors. I announced that not a single cent of the millions raised had ever gone to medical research or charity. It all went directly into his own pockets to deliberately evade federal taxes. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted from confused shock to absolute visceral revulsion. Local politicians who had previously shaken his hand were aggressively wiping their palms on their trousers, terrified of the toxic association. Investors were pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their legal teams to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Barbara let out a low, wailing sob from the center of the room, realizing her social standing was completely annihilated. She was no longer a respected matriarch. She was the wife of a despicable fraud who exploited a crippled child for financial gain. I walked back to the center podium, looking directly down at Richard. He was trembling violently, his expensive custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly looking far too large for his rapidly shrinking frame. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic raspy wheeze escaped his lips. He was completely broken. I leaned into the microphone to deliver the final killing blow. I stared straight into his wide, terrified eyes. I stated clearly and definitively that this logistics company is entirely insolvent and deeply entangled in massive federal wire fraud. I announced that Vanguard Holdings is officially withdrawing their lucrative offer. The $50 million acquisition is officially canceled. The heavy words struck Richard with the devastating physical force of a sledgehammer. He turned a sickening shade of ghost white. His eyes rolled back slightly and his legs gave out completely. He collapsed heavily into the leather chair behind the desk, clutching his chest as he watched $50 million and his entire legacy evaporate into thin air. The ballroom exploded into pure, unadulterated chaos. Investors were shouting in panic, demanding immediate answers. Reporters who had been invited to cover the Perfume launch were now aggressively snapping photographs of the financial evidence displayed on the screens, smelling the absolute corporate scandal of the entire decade. The execution was flawless, but the night was far from over. I stood on the stage watching the absolute destruction of my corrupt family unfold exactly as I had meticulously planned. Every single lie they told was now public knowledge. Their stolen empire was rapidly crumbling to dust right before my eyes. The heavy steel trap was finally sprung. Richard snapped out of his catatonic state driven by pure, desperate adrenaline. He launched himself forward out of the leather chair and lunged across the mahogany desk toward the podium. He aggressively reached out, trying to rip the cordless microphone from my grip. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and wild as he desperately sought to perform some kind of impossible damage control. He wanted to shout to the crowd that this was all a massive misunderstanding, a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, or a fabricated presentation designed to extort him. I simply took a calm, calculated step backward, letting him crash heavily against the wooden podium. He grabbed the microphone with shaking hands, but before he could utter a single pathetic defense, a booming sound echoed from the rear of the hall. The heavy oak double doors of the grand ballroom did not just open. They burst inward with a violent explosive force that made the remaining crystal champagne glasses rattle on the service trays. A highly coordinated team of federal authorities marched into the room, moving with absolute tactical precision. More than a dozen men and women wearing dark blue windbreakers with bold yellow letters spelling out FBI across the back flooded the entryway. They were immediately followed by a wave of sharply dressed investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, holding thick leather briefcases and federal warrants. The local police, whom my father had previously bribed to ignore the chemical assault on my son, were absolutely nowhere to be found. This was a federal raid executing a federal mandate, and nobody in this room possessed the wealth or the connections to make it disappear. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression, immediately shouted for everyone to remain exactly where they were. He announced that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was seizing the premises and executing multiple arrest warrants. The ballroom, which had been a chaotic symphony of panicking investors and aggressive reporters just seconds ago, fell into a terrified, breathless silence. The sheer gravity of the federal raid paralyzed the wealthy elite. They pressed themselves against the silk-covered walls, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive center of the room. Down on the main floor, Jamal proved exactly what kind of coward he truly was. The moment the federal agents announced their presence, he completely abandoned his wife. He dropped the hand of a weeping Brittany and frantically shoved a local politician out of his way. He darted toward the heavy swinging doors that led directly into the hotel catering kitchens, hoping to slip out through the service alley and vanish into the night. His velvet dinner jacket flapped wildly as he sprinted across the polished marble floor. He did not make it very far. 2 federal agents had already secured the perimeter, anticipating that the cowardly stockbroker might try to run. As Jamal reached out to push the kitchen doors open, one of the agents lunged forward and grabbed him by the shoulder. Jamal tried to physically wrestle his way free, throwing a clumsy, desperate punch. The second agent immediately swept the legs of my arrogant brother-in-law completely out from under him. Jamal hit the hard marble floor with a sickening thud, his expensive gold watch scraping loudly against the stone. The agent swiftly pinned his arms behind his back and slapped heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. They hauled him roughly to his feet. His designer clothes were completely rumpled, his arrogant smirk entirely erased. He looked like exactly what he was, a pathetic common criminal who had finally been caught. Up on the main stage, the lead FBI agent marched directly up the short staircase. He bypassed the terrified executives from Vanguard Holdings and stepped right up to the mahogany desk. Richard stood frozen behind the podium, still clutching the dead microphone in his trembling hands. The agent pulled a folded document from his inner jacket pocket and held it up. He stated in a loud, authoritative voice that he possessed a federal warrant for the immediate arrest of Richard. He loudly listed the devastating charges, confirming everything I had just presented on the massive projection screens. He cited massive corporate wire fraud, international money laundering, and severe federal tax evasion. The agent instructed my father to place his hands on the desk. Richard slowly complied, his entire body shaking violently as the reality of a decade in a federal penitentiary crashed down upon his shoulders. The agent pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt and secured the wrists of my father, effectively ending his reign as a wealthy, untouchable patriarch. As the cold steel clicked shut around his wrists, the agent began to read him his Miranda rights. The famous words echoed clearly across the silent ballroom, informing my father that he had the right to remain silent, and that anything he said could and absolutely would be used against him in a court of law. Richard turned his head slowly. He looked past the broad shoulder of the federal agent and locked his terrified eyes directly with mine. His face was a pale mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. The arrogant, powerful man who casually sipped expensive bourbon while my disabled son writhed in excruciating chemical agony was now gone. The greedy man who forged federal legal documents to maliciously steal my inheritance was dead. He looked up at me, finally realizing that I was the absolute, undisputed architect of his spectacular downfall. He was silently begging for my mercy, pleading for me to somehow call off the federal dogs and save his luxurious elite life. I stood exceptionally tall and unyielding, looking down at the broken, weeping man trapped in heavy steel handcuffs. I let a slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. I leaned in extremely close, ensuring he could hear the final devastating nail in his corporate coffin. "You shouldn't have stolen my son's face for your tax write-offs." The deafening silence on the main stage was suddenly shattered by a piercing, hysterical shriek from the center of the ballroom floor. I turned my gaze away from my broken father and looked down at the crowd. Brittany was having a complete and total psychological meltdown. The flashing bulbs of the press cameras originally brought in to document her glamorous lifestyle and business launch were now capturing her spectacular unraveling in high definition. She stomped her expensive stiletto heel against the polished marble, completely ignoring the fact that her father and her husband were currently being hauled away by federal agents. In her deeply narcissistic mind, the only tragedy occurring in this ballroom was the disruption of her personal spotlight. "You ruined my night," Brittany screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was now slightly disheveled, and her face was contorted into a mask of pure spoiled rage. Her emerald green designer gown swished aggressively as she threw a massive temper tantrum in front of the local politicians and business elites who were rapidly edging away from her. "You ruined my launch party. My perfume line is going to be global. I am going to be a billionaire, and you are just a jealous, pathetic loser trying to steal my moment." She continued to shriek, hurling vile insults and demanding that hotel security remove me from the stage. She acted as if a simple apology and a swift exit could somehow rewind time and erase the federal raid that was actively dismantling her entire family. She literally stomped her feet, demanding that the photographers stop taking pictures of the FBI agents and focus their lenses back on her and her promotional banners. It was a pathetic, delusional display of unbridled vanity. I stood on the elevated stage and silently looked down at the cruel woman who had callously sprayed toxic industrial chemicals directly into the vulnerable eyes of my disabled 7-year-old son. I felt no pity for her whatsoever. I felt no sisterly bond. I only felt the cold, calculating satisfaction of a fiercely protective mother who was about to deliver absolute, undeniable justice. I slowly raised my right hand high into the air, completely catching the immediate attention of the remaining crowd. I looked Brittany dead in the eye, took a breath, and with a sharp, echoing crack, I snapped my fingers. The sound was barely audible over her hysterical screaming, but the signal was perfectly received by the designated authorities waiting in the wings. 4 individuals wearing dark professional suits stepped forward from the shadows of the ballroom, completely separating themselves from the panicked sea of wealthy guests. They moved with a unified authoritative purpose, completely ignoring the chaotic scene surrounding Jamal and Richard. They marched directly toward the center of the floor, cutting off Brittany mid-sentence, as they surrounded her on all 4 sides. Brittany stopped screaming, her mouth hanging open in sheer confusion as the men and women in suits closed the perimeter around her. She tried to swat one of them away, yelling that they were ruining her designer dress and demanding they step back from her personal space. The lead agent, a tall woman with an absolutely no-nonsense expression, reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of federal documents bearing the official seal of the United States government. She held up her badge, identifying herself and her team as federal enforcement agents operating under the direct authority of the Food and Drug Administration and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Brittany scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. She aggressively told the agent that the FDA had no business crashing a luxury perfume launch, reiterating her fabricated marketing claims that her products were entirely pure, botanical, and organic. The lead agent did not even blink at the arrogant display. She calmly unfolded the top document and presented a federal injunction directly to my sister. The agent spoke in a loud, commanding voice that carried across the entire ballroom, ensuring that every single reporter and investor heard the absolute truth about her fraudulent beauty empire. Your so-called organic perfume contains illegal toxic industrial solvents and highly restricted corrosive compounds, the FDA agent announced firmly. The independent laboratory results confirm that your product is exceptionally hazardous to human health. Effective immediately, your business license is permanently revoked. Your corporate accounts are frozen, and your entire commercial inventory is currently being seized and destroyed as hazardous waste by federal hazard teams. Brittany gasped, the color rapidly draining from her face as the magnitude of her business collapse finally registered. She opened her mouth to argue, to claim it was a manufacturing error, but the agent was not finished. The agent pulled a pair of handcuffs from her belt and stepped directly into the personal space of my sister. She stated that the fraudulent business practices were only the beginning. Brittany, you are officially under arrest for the severe chemical assault of a minor, the agent declared, her voice echoing with absolute authority. We have secured your full confession on tape as well as the medical records detailing the second-degree corneal burns you inflicted upon your 7-year-old nephew. You are facing severe felony charges for child endangerment and aggravated assault with a toxic substance. Turn around and place your hands behind your back immediately. Brittany let out a terrified, guttural sob. The arrogant, untouchable golden child was completely gone. She physically collapsed inward, her knees buckling slightly as the federal agent aggressively spun her around. The cold steel handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, securing her hands tightly against the smooth fabric of her emerald green designer gown. She wept openly, the flashing cameras capturing her absolute downfall from every possible angle. I stood on the stage and watched the authorities march her away. I had promised to always protect my young son, and the toxic trash was finally being taken out tonight. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Royale Hotel emptied with astonishing speed. Wealthy investors, local politicians, and high society socialites scrambled toward the heavy oak doors like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Nobody wanted to be caught in a photograph, while federal agents dismantled a criminal enterprise. The flashing lights of the press cameras faded into the hallways as hotel security aggressively ushered reporters outside. The string quartet had long since fled the scene. The massive vaulted room, which had been radiating with arrogant celebratory energy just 30 minutes prior, now felt like a hollow, echoing tomb. The only people left inside the sprawling event space were my ruined family and the federal agents securing the perimeter. Richard remained slumped behind the mahogany desk on the main stage, his hands secured tightly in heavy steel handcuffs. He was staring blankly at the polished wood, completely unresponsive to the federal agent cataloging the fraudulent corporate documents. Across the room, Jamal sat heavily on a velvet chair, his head bowed in absolute defeat as an investigator read through his illegal offshore wire transfers. Brittany was sobbing uncontrollably near the floral pillars, her designer gown dragging against the marble floor, while a female agent advised her of her impending transfer. They were entirely contained. Their fraudulent empire was completely dismantled. Standing alone in the center of the vast, empty floor was my mother, Barbara. She was not in handcuffs, but her punishment was arguably much worse. She was watching the total systemic annihilation of her entire identity. The immense wealth, the elite social standing, the country club memberships, and the arrogant superiority she had wielded like a weapon her entire life were instantly vaporized. She was suddenly just a woman standing in an empty room, married to a convicted felon, mother to an arrested fraudster, and entirely destitute. She looked around at her husband, her golden child daughter, and her arrogant son-in-law. None of them could help her. None of them possessed any power anymore. Her eyes darted wildly around the room before locking onto me as I slowly descended the short staircase. I reached the marble floor and began walking toward the main exit, my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. Barbara realized in that exact moment that I was the absolute, undisputed victor. I was the only person in the entire building who held any actual power. I controlled the narrative, the financial evidence, and the ultimate fate of her entire existence. Driven by pure, unfiltered desperation, the former matriarch of our family broke into a frantic run. Her expensive heels clattered awkwardly against the stone floor. She threw herself directly into my path, physically blocking my route out. I stopped walking and looked down at her. The arrogant sneer she usually wore was entirely gone. Her perfectly styled hair was a mess, and her expensive makeup was running down her cheeks in dark, streaky lines. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, selfish terror. She did not fall to her knees out of genuine remorse or maternal love. She fell to her knees because she was absolutely terrified of losing her luxury mansion and her designer wardrobe. Barbara collapsed onto the cold marble floor, landing heavily right at my feet. She reached out with trembling hands and aggressively grabbed the fabric of my tailored charcoal gray slacks. Her grip was tight and desperate, wrinkling the pristine material I had carefully steamed. "Clara, please," she shrieked, her voice echoing loudly off the crystal chandeliers. "You have to stop this. We are family. I gave birth to you. You cannot do this to your own mother. Make them stop. Tell the federal agents you made a mistake. Tell them you will withdraw the audit. Please, Clara, I am begging you." She wept openly, clinging to my legs like a desperate drowning woman grasping at a life raft. She was trying to weaponize the biological connection she had spent 33 years completely ignoring. She wanted me to save her from the very same burning building she had intentionally set on fire. I stood completely still, looking down at the pathetic, weeping woman groveling on the floor. I felt absolutely no sympathy. I felt no lingering daughterly affection. I felt nothing but the cold, hard justice of a fiercely protective mother who had finally neutralized a dangerous threat to her child. I looked down at her grasping hands dirtying my suit. I did not bend down to comfort her. I did not offer her a single shred of reassurance. I aggressively kicked my leg forward, physically dislodging her frantic grip from my trousers. Barbara gasped, falling backward onto the marble floor, her hands hitting the ground to catch her balance. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock, completely unable to comprehend the absolute 0-degree temperature of my emotional response. I stared directly into her tear-filled eyes. I let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I leaned forward slightly, ensuring my voice carried the exact same casual, sickening tone she had used on Thanksgiving Day. "If you go to prison, maybe you will not see yourself as a burden anymore." I said, my voice perfectly level and exceptionally cruel. "At least your jail cell will smell better." I used their exact vile words against them, reflecting their pure evil right back into their extremely terrified faces. Barbara let out a devastated, sobbing gasp, covering her mouth with her hands, as the absolute finality of my statement struck her. She realized she was entirely defeated. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I turned my back on the pathetic scene and resumed my confident march toward the exit. The sharp, authoritative clicks of my glossy black stiletto heels echoed very loudly through the empty ballroom with every single step. I walked straight out the heavy oak doors, leaving the toxic garbage of my past completely behind me for good. 6 months passed since the night the grand ballroom of the Plaza Royale Hotel transformed into a federal crime scene. The swift machinery of the justice system dismantled the fraudulent empire my family had spent decades building. There were no highly paid fixers capable of stopping the avalanche of federal indictments that buried them alive. The trial was a highly publicized media circus, but the actual legal proceedings were incredibly brief. The massive 500-page dossier I meticulously compiled provided zero room for plea bargains. The federal prosecutors used my financial roadmap to secure airtight convictions against the two men who believed they were untouchable masters of the universe. Richard stood before a federal judge wearing a shapeless orange jumpsuit that was a far cry from the custom-tailored tuxedos he once favored. His gray hair had thinned dramatically, and his arrogant posture was permanently broken. The judge did not offer a single ounce of leniency for his age or his former status in the local business community. Richard was convicted of massive corporate tax evasion and wire fraud. He was sentenced to 8 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The man who once sat behind a mahogany desk sipping expensive bourbon and mocking the physical disability of his own grandson was now assigned to a concrete cell. His days of golfing with precinct captains were entirely over. Jamal faced an even harsher reality. The federal investigators unraveled his entire offshore money laundering operation with devastating precision. The arrogant stockbroker, who had sneered at my apartment and mocked my meager bank account, was completely stripped of his wealth. The government seized his sports cars, his luxury watches, and every single dollar he had hidden in the Cayman Islands. Jamal was handed a devastating 10-year sentence in federal prison for international money laundering and securities fraud. The smug smile he wore while bragging about his 6-figure commissions was erased the moment the heavy steel doors of the penitentiary locked behind him. He was reduced to an inmate number. While the men of the family were locked away behind high concrete walls, Brittany faced her own unique brand of absolute destruction. Her highly anticipated beauty brand launch was completely annihilated before a single bottle hit a retail shelf. The intervention by the Food and Drug Administration triggered an unstoppable chain reaction of legal and financial nightmares. The laboratory results proving her organic perfume contained toxic industrial solvents were immediately released to the public. An aggressive tidal wave of class action lawsuits flooded the civil courts. Customers who purchased early prototypes reported severe chemical burns and sued her for every penny she possessed. Her high-priced corporate lawyers abandoned her the moment her business accounts were frozen. Brittany miraculously managed to avoid serving time in a federal prison, but the judge handed down 5 years of incredibly severe probation. Her punishment extended far beyond the courtroom. The civil judgments completely bankrupted her. The emerald green designer gowns, the expensive salon highlights, and the luxury vehicles were repossessed to pay the massive medical damages awarded to the victims of her toxic vanity project. The golden child who never worked a hard day in her life was violently thrown into the harsh reality of extreme poverty. To comply with the strict terms of her court-ordered probation, Brittany was forced to secure immediate lawful employment. With her reputation utterly radioactive and her business license permanently revoked, she had zero options in the corporate or beauty sectors. The woman who once demanded I keep my disabled son out of her sight to preserve her wealthy aesthetic was now working a grueling minimum wage shift at a greasy fast food diner on the outskirts of the city. She spent her days wearing a stained polyester uniform, taking orders from angry customers, and scrubbing heavily soiled deep fryers. The smell of cheap cooking oil permanently replaced the scent of her perfumes. The profound collapse of my family was completed by the devastating social and financial annihilation of my mother. Barbara had spent her entire adult life meticulously cultivating an image of superior wealth and untouchable elegance. She had thrived on the power she wielded over those she deemed inferior. The federal raid not only took her husband and her stolen money, but it completely obliterated her entire identity. The government seized the sprawling suburban McMansion to pay off the massive tax penalties Richard had incurred. The indoor swimming pool and the expensive artwork were all auctioned off to the highest bidder. Barbara found herself entirely penniless and completely alone. The wealthy socialites and country club friends she spent decades impressing dropped her with breathtaking speed. The women who used to attend her lavish holiday parties instantly blocked her phone number and pretended they had never even met her. She became a toxic pariah in her own community. The fake charity scam involving my son was the ultimate social poison. Nobody in high society wanted to be associated with a woman who exploited a disabled child for tax write-offs. Her entire social circle abandoned her to the wolves without hesitation. With no money and zero employable skills, Barbara was forced to relocate to the only housing she could afford. She moved into a tiny, cramped, and moldy studio apartment in an undesirable neighborhood. The walls of her home were paper-thin, and the plumbing constantly leaked. The woman who used to lounge by an indoor pool flipping through high-fashion magazines now spent her days sitting in a damp, drafty room staring at peeling wallpaper. She had no visitors and no prospects for a better future. She was isolated, left alone with nothing but the suffocating silence of her consequences. She sacrificed her own flesh and blood to protect her precious social standing, only to end up with nothing but misery. Every single morning, she would wake up totally consumed by profound regret that she could never possibly escape from or ever undo. While my mother sat decaying in her tiny, moldy apartment, I was busy finalizing the ultimate legal victory in civil court. I did not just want to see my family behind bars or bankrupted by government fines. I wanted what was rightfully mine. I hired an incredibly ruthless estate litigator to aggressively pursue the full restoration of my stolen inheritance. Because my father had forged federal documents to drain the trust fund, the civil judge ruled entirely in my favor, without a single moment of hesitation. The court officially ordered the complete restitution of the original $500,000. But the financial bleeding did not stop there. Recognizing the extreme emotional distress and the severe physical harm inflicted upon my son, the judge awarded me massive punitive damages. These damages were extracted directly from the liquidated assets of my father before the federal government even took their cut. By the time the final gavel fell, I walked out of the courtroom with a settlement check worth more than $2 million. It was the absolute ultimate irony. My parents stole my inheritance to fund a luxury lifestyle, and in the end, their criminal greed paid for the permanent financial security of the very daughter they despised. I deposited the massive check into a highly secure private account, ensuring that neither I nor my son would ever have to worry about money again. I officially resigned from my high-stress corporate auditing job at the financial firm in Manhattan. I had spent years tracking down corporate criminals, but the most important fraud I ever exposed was the one living inside my own family tree. It was time to focus entirely on building a beautiful, peaceful life for my little boy. I used a portion of the massive civil settlement to purchase a stunning custom-built home nestled perfectly in a quiet, safe neighborhood, completely far away from the toxic suburban elite circle my parents used to occupy. I specifically chose a beautiful single-story accessible house with extra wide hallways and incredibly smooth hardwood floors, ensuring Leo would never ever have to struggle with his metal leg brace inside our own home again. The property featured a massive, sprawling backyard, completely surrounded by tall, mature oak trees and a high wooden privacy fence. It was an absolute fortress of pure safety and immense comfort. I spent several weeks happily furnishing the rooms with warm, bright colors, completely erasing the cold, sterile environment of the cheap apartment we finally left behind forever. I bought Leo a brand new wooden swing set and hired contractors to build a small custom treehouse just for him. The doctors told us to keep his eyes protected from harsh light during the first few months of his recovery, so I installed motorized blackout shades in every single room of the house. I made absolutely sure that his environment was completely optimized for his physical healing and his emotional well-being. Every single brick of our beautiful new sanctuary was essentially paid for by the extreme arrogance and the horrific cruelty of the people who tried to break us. They fully intended to leave us completely destitute and begging for financial scraps, but instead, they unknowingly bought us an absolute paradise. It is a bright, beautiful Tuesday morning, and I am standing on the sprawling wooden back porch of our new home. I am holding a warm mug of freshly brewed black coffee, letting the gentle morning breeze wash over my face. I look out across the vibrant green lawn and smile. Leo is running happily through the thick grass, chasing a yellow butterfly. He is not wearing any bandages. His vision is perfectly clear and completely restored. The experimental corneal transplant worked exactly as the brilliant pediatric surgeon promised. He can see the bright blue sky, the vibrant green leaves, and the tiny yellow wings fluttering in the wind. The sound of his joyful, carefree laughter echoes loudly across the peaceful yard. It is the most beautiful sound in the entire world. I take a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace settle deep into my bones. There are no more cruel phone calls to ignore. There are no more condescending family dinners to endure. The toxic bloodline has been completely severed once and for all. I do not miss my mother or my father. I do not think about my sister scrubbing deep fryers or my brother-in-law sitting in a small concrete cell. They are nothing but ghosts to me now. They belong entirely to the past. As I watch my incredibly brave son enjoy the safe, beautiful life he truly deserves, I am reminded of a very important lesson. Blood does not automatically make someone family. Sometimes the people who share your genetic makeup are the exact same people who will happily watch you drown just to protect their own selfish interests. They thought I was a weak, helpless scapegoat they could kick around forever. They thought my silence was a permanent sign of submission. But when you push a mother into a dark corner, you do not get a victim. You get a highly lethal predator. I destroyed their entire corrupt empire to protect my child, and I would do it all over again in a single heartbeat. You owe absolutely nothing to abusive family members. You have every right to protect your peace, your finances, and your children. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. I want you to share your own stories of escaping toxic families and setting hard boundaries in the comments section below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to finally walk away from their own abusers. Thank you for listening to my journey, and always remember to fiercely protect your own precious peace of mind each and every single beautiful new day ahead. The story of Clara and her relentless pursuit of justice offers a profound reflection on the true meaning of family and the absolute necessity of unbreakable boundaries. For years, Clara accepted the role of the family scapegoat, enduring subtle cruelties and overt disrespect. However, the pivotal lesson her journey teaches us is that sharing DNA with someone does not grant them a permanent consequence-free pass to inflict harm. Society frequently pushes the narrative that we must forgive our relatives no matter what, simply because blood is thicker than water. Clara's narrative shatters this toxic myth, proving that genuine family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, empathy, and protection, not manipulation and greed. When her son Leo was severely injured, Clara experienced a profound awakening. She realized that continuing to endure her family's abuse in the name of loyalty was actually a betrayal of her own child. Her transformation from a silent victim to a fiercely protective force demonstrates that walking away from toxic relatives is not an act of cruelty, but an act of profound self-respect and survival. It requires immense courage to sever ties with the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, especially when they use that very biological connection as a weapon of extortion. Ultimately, the greatest takeaway is that we possess the power to define our own families. We are not obligated to set ourselves on fire just to keep our abusers warm. By stepping out of the shadows and holding her abusers fully accountable, Clara broke a generational cycle of trauma and built a safe, beautiful sanctuary for her son. If you have ever felt trapped by the obligations of a toxic relationship, please share your story in the comments below and take that first brave step toward reclaiming your peace.